about 12?
Have you seen a living boy?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to do another book review. You hear some Poco Loco in the background from the popular movie Coco. And I thought I'd introduce this topic with a little bit of Mexican music. This is Joseph Holbrook bringing you another helpful book review. And this one has a lot of material. So I'm going to split it into two videos. And this first video will deal with the historical context for a book by Graham Greene, written in 1939, if I remember correctly. I don't have my notes in front of me because they're on the computer, and I don't know how to run this screen recording video and look at my notes at the same time. So hopefully in the future I'll be more tech savvy. Graham Greene wrote a book. I do have some notes here. Graham Greene wrote a book called The Power and the Glory, which he was based on a trip he took through Mexico in 1938 in the state of Tabasco, which is along the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico side of Mexico and near Veracruz. And at this point in time in 1938, when he traveled through Mexico, there was an intense persecution going on against Roman Catholics by the state authorities. Earlier, there had been persecution at the federal level. As an outgrowth of the Mexican Revolution. So, because this is my field of study, I can't do the book review without a little historical background in Christianity or Roman Catholicism in Mexico. So Graham Greene took a trip through the state of Tabasco in 1938. He wrote a book, a travel log about his travels through Mexico called The Lawless Roads, which I have not read. And he wrote a fictional novel called The Power and the Glory, which I read about 10 or 12 years ago, and I had forgotten a good bit of it. And I decided for this reader's retreat that's coming up 2019 in Atlanta that I would reread it because my friend Dr. John Norton had read Graham Greene's book, The Quiet American, which is set in Vietnam, and I think he wrote it in the 1980s. So let me give a little background on Mexican Catholicism. Let me first say that Graham Greene himself claims that he began his journey to faith in 1938 during this trip to Mexico, that he was so impacted by the humble faith of Mexican peasants and that he couldn't help but being profoundly moved. And so this book represents his first attempt very recently after beginning to move towards faith to articulate that faith in the context of a pretty vicious persecution of Christianity. So what I want to say about Mexican Catholicism is that the Mexican church was an unusual church in Latin America. The Mexico, of course, was in the conquered territories of the Aztecs, conquered by Hernan Cortez in 1519. The two strongest areas of indigenous population and also of Spanish colonial administration in colonial Latin America were Peru and Mexico, precisely because each of them had been capitals to fairly large Indian or Native American empires. The Aztecs in central Mexico and the Incas in the along the coast of Pacific coast of excuse me, I got to learn how to handle all these devices. I've got my outline up here on my phone, but it keeps wanting to fade out on me. The ink is along the Pacific coast of Peru and Chile and up to Ecuador. And so the Catholic uh, colonial administration and the Roman Catholic Church, Spanish Church, in these two locations were the strongest in the Americas during the colonial period, precisely because the indigenous population lived in those two areas and the most intensive missionary work was carried out, first in Mexico and about 30 years later in Peru. The Mexican church is unique because Hernan Cortez wrote to King Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and also the Emperor of Spain and Spain's territories, asking for missionaries. And as a consequence, the Spanish sent 12 Franciscan priests to Mexico in 1524. They were called the 12 Apostles, and they came with a high degree of fervor and commitment to the cause of proselyting or evangelizing the Native American indigenous populations. The Franciscans were unique. In other parts of Latin America, particularly in Brazil, it was primarily Jesuits. You may be familiar with the film of Robert De Niro, The Mission, which accounts the Jesuit missions among the Guarani Indians in Paraguay along the border with Brazil. There were also Augustinians, Dominicans, Mesodadians. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. There were a number of other missionary orders that arrived in the New World to work as missionaries, regular orders, as opposed to secular orders or secular clergy, which were under the regular parish administration or diocesan administration, which was ruled by the Spanish monarchy and basically was a department of Spanish royal colonial administration. The regular orders had a bit of latitude because they were not always as directly connected to the royalty, the monarchy. Sometimes they were more directly connected to the papacy, particularly in the case of the Augustinians. The Franciscans were unique because the Franciscans had been influenced by Joachim of Fiore, who is a mystic and Franciscan priest in the 1100s, early 1200s, who developed a theology that was very apocalyptic. He divided history and divided the scriptures into three ages or three epochs: the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Spirit, or the kingdom of the Father, the kingdom of the Son, and the kingdom of the Spirit. If you read the Trinity and the Kingdom by Jürgen Moltmann, you'll see a section in there discussing Joachim, I can't pronounce his name, Joachim de Fiore. He was an Italian Franciscan, discussing his apocalyptic theology. Of course, the Old Testament was the kingdom of the Father, the New Testament was the kingdom of the Son, and the Franciscans believed that with the discovery of the New World, the kingdom of the Spirit was about to be unveiled or arise. And they believed there was a short time until the return of Christ. Therefore, they needed to convert as many people as possible. Keep in mind, at the same time, the Protestant Reformation was going on in Europe, and the Roman Catholic Church was in the throes of losing nearly half of Europe to Lutherans and Calvinists and other Protestant reformers. So even as this setback was happening for the Roman Catholic Church, and of course Spain was heavily involved because most of Europe was under the control of Charles V, even as this was happening, millions of new people were discovered in the Western Hemisphere. The Franciscans adopted kind of a hurry-up offense. I'm using a football terminology there, which I shouldn't do because I'm not a football fan, but a hurry-up defense, I'm not sure which it is. But they they began baptizing large numbers of indigenous people. Some of them claimed to have baptized millions of indigenous people. And the other orders were fairly critical of their methods, feeling like they should slow down and take more time to indoctrinate the Native Americans and teach them the basics of the gospel before they baptized them. But the Franciscans felt a sense of urgency, and in a short time, in 20 or 30 years, millions upon millions of indigenous Mexicans had been baptized into the Catholic faith, and it became apparent with time that most, if not most of them, didn't have a clue about what the tenets of the Christian faith were, and they simply brought in their I hate it when a cigar crumbles. They simply brought in their indigenous gods and renamed them with Catholic saint names, and in many cases, some Catholic sanctuaries or chapels were built over top of shrines to Aztec deities, such as was the case with the Aztec goddess Tonitzin, or Earth Filth Eater, who was a mother god type goddess, and she was the over her shrine was built the chapel to the Virgin of Guadalupe, who was a dark-skinned virgin who appeared to an Indian Juan Diaz. So the Mexican church grew quickly, if superficially, and over time, with gifts to the church, the Mexican church became the wealthiest organization in Mexico, and basically dominated Mexico's politics, economics, culture, society. Was pretty much dominated by the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico. This was also true in Peru and other parts of Latin America, although maybe to a lesser extent, because of the fervor and dedication of the Franciscans and their introduction of millions of indigenous people into the faith, so to speak. The Mexican church became probably the most powerful in Latin America. It also dabbled in the political affairs of the country and made an alliance with the Conservative Party. So after the Wars of Independence against Spain, which by the way were initiated by two Mexican priests, Padre Hidalgo and later a mestizo, Padre Morelos, led the first attempts to gain independence from Spain. After that independence process, the Catholic Church had to renegotiate its position with a nation state, the nation state of Mexico, also in Colombia, also in Peru, and this was a transition, a difficult transition for the papacy and for the Spanish Church. And along with this process, the Mexican Church allied itself with the Conservative Party. The conservatives tended to be pro-Hispanic tradition. They were pro-military. They were pro-monarchy. And they were pro-Catholic. And so you can see why the Catholic Church might ally themselves with this political party. The liberals, on the other hand, led by Benito Juarez, were pro-free market, pro-constitutional checks and balances. They were pro-individual rights. They were in favor of separation of church and state, or at least to some degree in the beginning. And they were also anti-clerical. Anti-clerical in this context means believing that priests and the church hierarchy should stay out of politics. It does not mean anti-religious or anti-Catholic. Many devout Catholic liberals, many liberals in Latin America were devout Catholics, but they were also anti-clerical, believing that they needed to bring in Protestants, for example, to help develop educational reform and to help develop a sort of enlightenment in Latin America that the priests of the Catholic Church tended to oppose. So, inevitably, the conservatives and the liberals went to war in 1858. It was called La Reforma, and the liberals won. 1858 to 1861, there was a civil war in Mexico between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. The liberals won under Benito Juarez. They got set to begin to enact some anti-clerical reforms to get the church out of politics, since the church was their political enemy, allied with the conservatives. And the conservatives were not happy about losing. So what did they do? They invited Napoleon III of France to send troops and to establish a monarchy, a French monarchy. And so this is called the War of the French Intervention, which began in 1861, roughly about the same time as the U.S. Civil War, and didn't end until 1867. The French troops were defeated, and they were withdrawn from Mexico, and Maximilian, a prince of Austria, who had been sent to be the new monarch of the Mexican people, and who himself probably wanted to be a serious and responsible monarch, and was himself a liberal. He was left without support and was captured and executed in 1867. This left a bit of a bad taste in the mouth of the liberals towards not only the conservatives, who were the losers twice now, but also towards the Roman Catholic Church. Also, as I've said, the Roman Catholic Church was the largest landowner in Mexico. It was also the largest banker. This cigar is not cooperating. It had tremendous wealth tied up in nunneries and monasteries and lands. When the conservatives were in power, they would force the Catholic Church to make loans to it. When the liberals were in power, they enacted anti-clerical legislation and began to strip the church of its possessions and its lands. This set up, as you might expect, a scenario of tension and conflict between Mexican liberals and Roman Catholics in Mexico. Under Porfirio Diaz, who followed Benito Juarez, who was a liberal, but became a liberal dictator, he decided that the most important thing was investment, development of infrastructure. He became a dictator. He cracked down on crime and vigilante groups and militias, and he brought order to the Mexican countryside in order to invite foreign investment. And as part of his attempt to bring social stability, he had a rapprochement with the Catholic Church and began to allow the Catholic Church to resume some of its former privileges. Along comes 1910 and the Mexican Revolution. After some 25 years of Porfirio Diaz's rule, known as the Porfiriato, and Francisco Madero won an election, but then he won the election, but then was pushed aside by Diaz, and he led a revolution. He himself was a wealthy landowner, so it would have probably been a moderate revolution. But then he was killed, and his vice president were killed by one of the Mexican generals with the encouragement of the U.S. ambassador in Mexico City. And I think that was 1911, and a whole different brutal and radical phase of the Mexican Revolution begun with General Obregón, from a working class background, Pancho Villa, who was practically a Mexican bandit and folk hero, and also Emiliano Zapata, who led the peasants, the Mexican peasants, who were primarily Nahuatl speaking, that is, former Aztecs, who had lost lands under the Porfiriato. And so the Mexican Revolution went on for about 20 years, cost a couple 100,000 lives, if not more, and resulted in the Constitution of 1917, which was pretty severely anti-clerical in nature. Now, there's something about anti-clerical that I need to explain, and that is anti-clerical means that priests should stay out of politics. But sometimes when a church, like happened in France at the beginning of the 20th century, when a church has been very powerful and very involved in politics, the opposition begins to see it as a threat, and the opposition goes beyond anti-clerical to anti-religious or anti-Catholic. What you see today in France, for example, is beyond anti-clerical. It's against the law in France to wear any religious symbolic clothing in public. You can't display a cross. You can't wear a hijab. The early 20th century French Republic was very anti-clerical and anti-religious. And it still is today, actually. And this is what happened in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution became anti-religious and began to persecute Catholics and try to strip them of their power so they would not be a political threat. This led in 1926, under President Plutarco Calles, this led to the Cristero Rebellion. This was a rebellion of poor Catholic peasants against the federal government, seeking for the right to express their faith. It went on from 1926 to 1928. 100,000 people died. At one point, there were 25,000 women, Catholic women, fighting in Brigadas Femeninas. And President Calles responded by arresting and executing one priest for every one of the federal soldiers that were killed, or at least for as much as he could. And so the events that you read in The Power and Glory are based on actual historical precedents. Graham Greene makes the priest, the whiskey priest, a somewhat sympathetic figure in the book, but it's important for you to realize the precedent, the conflict that had gone on for over a century between the church and the state that led up to such a drastic conflict between the federal government and between poor Mexican peasants who were Catholic. The Cristero War actually ended in 1928, but after it ended, with help from mediation from the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, but after it ended, Calles went back on his word and executed another 500 Cristeros and continued to hunt down priests and arrest them, and continued until he was replaced by another president in 1938. So that brings us up to Graham Greene's visit to Mexico in 1938 and took the state of Tabasco. The state of Tabasco was under a particularly brutal governor who was viciously anti-Catholic, and they actually were hunting down and executing priests in the state of Tabasco. So that part of Graham Greene's novel is based accurately on the historical conditions of the time. And so that brings us up to The Power and the Glory by author Graham Greene, which I will continue in the next video.